Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Frodo, and it's time for another daily dose of Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth spoilers. So we've reached day 2 of spoiler season, and thankfully today, not quite as overwhelming as yesterday. Good lord, did we have a lot of cards to talk about yesterday, but we got some pretty sweet stuff. One of the spiciest Lifegain commanders ever printed. The rest of the land cycles ways to cheat massive creatures into playing Mount Doom, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking sweet new Lord of the Rings cards. Before we do, 2 quick reminders. Number 1, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. And number 2, to keep up on the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk more sweet new cards from Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth. Next up, we got a new legendary red enchantment in Fires of Mount Doom. So Fires of Mount Doom, 3 mana, legendary enchantment, it's a red card. When it ETBs, it deals 2 damage to a creature an opponent controls, and you can destroy all the equipment attached to that creature. Then you can pay 3 mana, exile top card of your library, you can play the card this turn. When you play a card this way, it deals 2 damage to each player. Quick note on that last ability, because it says play rather than cast, you can play lands with it, which is a nice upside. That is a little bonus of Fires of Mount Doom. So is Fires of Mount Doom a good Magic card? And I think the answer is yes, but in a very narrow set of circumstances. So as removal, it's honestly not very good. 2 damage only to a creature for 3 mana at sorcery speed kind of looks like the worst shock of all time. Although, if you are in a very equipment-heavy meta, then it becomes a little bit more exciting. It's like a turn to slag effect. If your opponent has some big Voltron-y threat with 2 or 3 equipment on it, then 2 damage, even if it doesn't kill the creature, whatever, I don't care, just blowing up all the equipment on that creature is probably worth it for 3 mana. So if you're in a playgroup or in a meta where equipment are a thing, Fires of Doom goes way up in value. Then the second part of the card, exiling top card of your library, letting you play it, etc., doing some damage. There's tons of red cards that do this. Outpost Seizure, Chandra's Theater of Forest. The list is super duper long. Look at a Prosper decking commander and you'll see all the different versions of this effect. There's upsides and downsides for Fires of Mount Doom compared to the other versions. So the downside is you gotta pay 3 mana to get the card, which is honestly a lot when a lot of these other cards are doing it for free. The upside of Fires of Mount Doom is it's repeatable. This is like the Triskaidekaphile version of the red impulse draw effect. Like if you have a ton of mana, you can use this again and again and be drawing multiple cards in a turn. And I think that's where this card's gonna be at its best. In some sort of big mana, or better yet, infinite mana deck, Fires of Mount Doom is just straight up game over. And there are some mono red infinite mana combos that are perfect for commander decks. I guess technically you could play them maybe in modern, although they would be pretty hard to pull off. But like in commander, Mana Geyser Reiterate. Yeah, Mana Geyser, it's gonna make a ton of mana because your opponents have a bunch of tap lands. You reiterate with buyback to copy it, and then you do it again and again and again until you make 1,000,000 mana. And then Fires of Mount Doom just wins you the game. You get to draw your entire deck. If you're at the highest life total, you just play those cards and burn your opponents out of the game. If you're not at the highest life total, then you use whatever cards you draw to cast them and win the game that way. Or Dockside Extortionist Cloudstone Curio with any other creature. You Dockside, and then you make a bunch of treasures, then you play the other creature, pick up Dockside, do it again, loop them back and forth, and then you Fires of Mount Doom, draw your deck, win the game. So in some sort of big mana or infinite mana commander deck, I'm actually kind of hyped about Fires of Mount Doom being a really sweet finisher. Plus in commander, there's a lot of equipment decks. People love their equipment decks in commander, and if your opponent's coming at you with a big Voltron equipment commander, 3 mana to blow up all the equipment, and if you get lucky, maybe kill the commander, is actually a pretty good effect. The other place this could have some relevance is in legendary theme decks. There's not a lot of support for legendary enchantments in specific, but a commander like Sisay, let's say, can tutor up legendary permanents, so maybe it's worth playing a copy. You can tutor up the Fires of Mount Doom when you need it if there's an equipment commander on the battlefield, or if you just need some card advantage, and then it grows your Sisay. So I think that's the main home for this card. So a little bit sketchy as removal in a vacuum, but there's certainly some sweet uses in big mana decks that can make Fires of Mount Doom really good. We also got Witch King, Bringer of Ruin, which, meh. 6 mana, 5/3 flying, legendary Wraith Noble. When it attacks, defending player sacks a creature with the least power among creatures they control. So, on one hand, this is a 6 mana flyer that's repeatable removal. As long as it sticks on the battlefield and it's attacking, your opponent's going to be sacking a creature each turn, which is kinda nice. The biggest problem with Witch King, well, really there's two. One is the stats are pretty lackluster. 6 mana, 5/3, not great stats. The other problem is you're going to be making your opponent sack their worst creature theoretically, or their least powerful creature, which is often going to be their worst creature. So a lot of times this is going to be making your opponent sack a 1/1 token or something, which kind of reduces its value. We've seen some similar cards in the past. Neferox, kind of similar, except it has better stats. Archon of Cruelty, obviously more mana, but has a way more absurd trigger ETBs and when it attacks, and it's making your opponent sacrifice anything. So I think Witch King, it's just a little bit underpowered, but I still think this card does serve a purpose, and I think the purpose is Wraith Commander deck. So Wraith is a relatively new tribe as far as actually having support in Magic. There's a couple of really old Wraiths from the early days, but there's never been a Wraith Legend until now. So if you want to build a Wraith themed commander deck, you're gonna want a Wraith Legend leading that deck, and now Witch King Bringer of Ruin joins Witch King of Angmar is a possible option. So I don't think it's a strong commander or an especially strong card, but if you specifically care about Wraiths, then I think this is either leading your deck or more likely in the 99 of your Wraith deck. We also got the last two members of the rare land cycle, one of my favorite aspects of this set. So the blue member of the cycle, Rivendell. So it's a blue legendary land. It comes into play tapped unless you control legendary creature. It adds a blue, and then you can pay 2 and tap it and scry 2, but you can only activate it if you control a legendary creature. So this one, I would probably rank in the middle of the pile of this cycle in terms of power level. On one hand, we've seen Castle Vantress see quite a bit of play, and that is 4 mana to scry 2. So Rivendell is half the cost. You do have to have a legendary creature, but it's half the cost for scrying, which is actually pretty nice. 2 mana to scry 2, I guess technically 3 because you have to tap the Rivendell as well, but that's actually a pretty good rate. The problem is where Castle Vantress sees play. If you look at decks that actually play Castle Vantress in 60 card formats, they are almost exclusively creature-free or creature-like control decks that just don't have any legendary creatures. They're like Teferi Hero of Dominaria style decks, Torrential Gearhulk style decks. So in those decks, I don't think you can play Rivendell because you're just not going to have a legend. So it's always going to come into play untapped, and you're never going to be able to activate the scry mode. So you really need a deck that doesn't exist, I think, to make this card work. You need a deck that's slow and controlling and can afford to spend 3 mana to scry, but it also needs to consistently have a legendary creature so you can activate Rivendell, which I guess means this is probably a commander card. In Commander, these lands are going to be really good because you have a legend in your command zone, so you should be able to turn it on consistently. Plus, Commander decks tend to have a lot of legendary creatures just because Wizards is printing so many legends these days. So if this didn't have the legendary creature restriction, I would be a lot more excited about it for formats like Legacy or Modern. But with the legendary creature restriction, it's going to take a very specific deck and a type of deck that I'm not even sure exists to really make it work. We also have the red member of the cycle, which I think is actually really sneaky good, maybe even in Modern, Mines of Moria. So Mines of Moria, same setup, ETB is tapped and lets you have a legend, it makes a red mana, and then its ability is pay 4 and tap it, exile 3 cards from your graveyard, and create 2 treasure tokens. So first off, it's not an especially efficient card. We know that making a treasure token costs 1 mana. We see it on Strike the Rich. So making 2 for essentially 5 mana, since you have to tap mines as well, it's not efficient. At the same time, that doesn't really matter because this is coming attached to a land, and lands that do more than just add mana are really strong in Magic. So even though the ability isn't that efficient and you gotta have cards in your graveyard, I still think this card could be really good. So where would this possibly see play in Modern? And the answer is in one of the best decks in the entire format, Indomitable Creativity. So there is a downside here. The downside is, in an Indomitable Creativity deck, you are never going to have mines come into play untapped. It will literally always be tapped because you can't really play creatures, let alone legendary creatures. So it's going to be a tap land, which is a big cost, and maybe that's too big of a cost for these decks, but there's also a massive, massive upside. Creativity decks pretty good at filtering and filling the graveyard. You got Fable the Mirror Breaker, cantrips, fetch lands. So 3 cards in the graveyard's not a big deal. And then Mines just is 4 mana plus tap it and exile some cards to make 2 treasures. And then you can turn those treasures into your Archons of Cruelty or whatever finisher you're using with Indomitable Creativity. So once you get around the fact this is going to come into play tapped, it actually seems very strong in creativity decks. The other thing I really like about it in creativity is it's another way you can just hardcast your finishers. If your opponent manages to, I don't know, surgical extraction in your Indomitable Creativities, and you can't win by cheating your threats into play, well, Mines can just make enough mana that you hardcast your Archons of Cruelty and win that way. So I would not be surprised to see this be like a nice one-of in Indomitable Creativity, although maybe it turns out that just playing a tap land is too punishing, but I think I would at very least try it because it seems so perfect for that deck. The other place that Mines will be really good is in commander decks, and really, you can play this in any red commander deck in your utility slot. We've seen that treasures are just really powerful. Making treasures is never going to be a bad thing, but it seems especially well suited for treasure matters commander decks. Prosper is a treasure deck. Magda loves treasures. Even something like Corvold, it's not a treasure deck, but treasures are sackable, so it feels your Corvold. So if you have any treasure synergies, I think this goes way, way up in value. And then those decks are also playing things that'll even further power up Mines. Synergies for treasures like Zorn giving you an extra treasure, Professional Facebreaker turning those treasures into cards, or Goldspan Dragon to double the mana. So I actually really like Mines. I think easy commander staple, and honestly, outside of maybe the green member of the cycle, I think all these cards will see a lot of play in commander decks, especially monocolor decks, but this one might be one of the better options for Modern, specifically because it's good in Indomitable Creativity, and maybe there's some argument to playing in something like Belcher as well. We also got Doors of Durin, which is a pretty spicy new artifact. So 5 mana Gruul legendary artifact. Whenever you attack, scry 2. And then you can reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature card, put it on the battlefield, tapped and attacking until your next turn against Trample if you control a dwarf, and Hexproof if you control an elf. So disregard the elf and dwarf tags, like I think that's more flavor text. The big deal here is this is a 5 mana artifact that can potentially be cheating something huge into play from your library every single turn, which is a really, really strong effect. So the best comparison I could think of was Impromptu Raid, but I think Doors is just way better. Impromptu Raid, it costs mana and the creature only lasts for a turn. Doors seems like a pretty strong option if you're a deck that's planning to cheat big things into play. So what you want to do with this card, I think, is build a deck where you can get a Emrakul or an Itali or a Crater Hoof, something big in game ending on the top of your deck. You can't just play it fairly and trust that the scrying will give you some value, and the scry 2 does help with the play it fairly plan, but it's gonna be at its best when you can tutor the finisher you want to the top of your deck. Thankfully, there's quite a few cards that can do this. Worldly Tutor, Muvani Beast Tracker, Brutalizer Exarch. If you get into black, you got all the black tutors like Vampiric Tutor. So this could just be setting that Crater Hoof or Itali or Emrakul, whatever the finisher is, on the top of your deck. There is a nice little bonus, I guess, if you have an elf or dwarf. But as I said before, I think this is mostly flavor text. I don't think this is an elf tribal or dwarf tribal card. It's a cheat big things into play Gruul card. While commander decks will probably be the main home for this card, I think that there could be some modern potential. Probably not from a like super competitive perspective, but I think we can build a really fun against the odds deck around it. So you're in Gruul, and Gruul is probably the best ramp color. You get stuff like Arbor Elf and Utopia Sprawl, which can let you be playing Doors like on turn 3, even quicker sometimes. So you can get this on the battlefield really quickly, and then you get a bunch of backup ways of cheating things into play. Ilharg, Through the Breach, Shrew, and Hazaret. So there's a bunch of backup pieces. So I could certainly imagine playing a deck where I'm jamming 4 copies of Doors, and then playing like Through the Breach or Ilharg or Drew and Hazaret as a backup, and just loading up with Eldrazi and trying to spin into something big in game ending really quickly. So whether or not it's the best way to build this deck or the most competitive way to build the deck, that remains to be seen, but I actually think it's of a power level that you could certainly win a lot of games with in Modern if you can build the right deck. As far as Commander is concerned, I think you can jam this in any deck that's built around big creatures. Like if you're playing a bunch of big top end threats, it's gonna probably be worth considering. Like, scrying every turn is nice, getting things for free is nice. If you're playing a bunch of cheap creatures, it loses a lot of its value. Or if you're playing a deck that just doesn't have many creatures, if you're only playing 20 creatures in your deck, even with 2 scries, your odds of hitting any creature is pretty low, and your odds of hitting one of your big finishing creatures is even lower. But it seems especially good in Hans Eriksson. That's the most obvious home. Like, Hans kind of cares about the same thing. You get to cheat creatures into play from the top of your deck. So Doors is a nice backup in Hans deck. I could see playing it in like a Tally, just these big Gruul ramp style decks. Xenagos is another deck that just plays a ton of big things so you can take advantage of Xenagos. Doors seems like an easy inclusion there as well. So Doors of Durin, it's a really cool card. It's like the ultimate Timmy card, just cheating massive things into play from the top of your deck for free. Obviously, there's some risk. It's going to whiff sometimes. Sometimes it's going to be 5 mana, scry 2, there's a land on top of your deck, do nothing. But the upside is there to do some really frightening things. Next up, we got a new equipment, a new legendary equipment in Bilbo's Ring. So Bilbo's Ring, 3 mana. It says as long as it's your turn, equipped creature has hexproof and can't be blocked. And when equipped creature attacks alone, you draw a card and lose a life. You can equip it for 4 or to a halfling for 1. So Bilbo's Ring, it's kind of an interesting card. It's sort of like a Mask of Riddles is this equipment that gives evasion and lets you draw a card every turn. Can see comparisons to like Mask of Memory and Whisper Silk Cloak. Like, the ability to have an equipment that lets you draw an extra card each turn, that's pretty good in an Equipment Matters commander deck. The protection, actually, I don't think is that good at all. Like, the unblockability is nice, but only getting hexproof during your turn, I don't think is the most powerful ability, because your opponent could just kill it during their turn. But this seems like a card that's designed to be played with some of the new halflings. The biggest issue with the card, I think, is the fact that equipping for 4 is just way too much. So you really want to be a halfling deck where this is equipping for 1 in a halfling deck. This is a pretty good card. You can move it around easily. You're always going to be drawing extra cards. So if you're playing like a Merry deck or a Pippin deck or a Frodo deck, then I think Bilbo's Ring is going to be kind of exciting. On the other hand, in just a generic equipment deck where you're paying 4 to equip this, then Bilbo's Ring loses a lot of its appeal. As I mentioned before, I don't think the hexproof ability is that good. It can be good at letting you get in a single attack. I think maybe that's the upside, where you get it on a creature and you're kind of guaranteed to get it in 1 attack. But if your opponent needs to deal with your threat, they can always just cast their Swords to Plowshares or their Doomblade or whatever during their own turn rather than during your turn, and then you're not getting any protection out of Bilbo's Ring. So Bilbo's Ring, basically a halfling tribal card. I think the 4 equip cost pretty much means it won't see any play in any format outside of decks with a bunch of halflings, but halflings got a good equipment theme, and we're getting a lot of them in that set. So if you are building a halfling deck, I could see playing this for sure. Next up, we have a new demon, a demon avatar in the Balrog Flame of Udun. So the Balrog, 5 mana 7/7, legendary avatar demon with trample, but it's got a pretty big drawback. When a legendary creature an opponent controls dies, you gotta put it on the bottom of its owner's library. So if your opponent's random legend dies, you essentially lose the Balrog, which is actually pretty obnoxious. So I think the Balrog is actually just straight up pretty bad. It does have one upside, which is it's got good stats. 5 mana 7/7 trample kind of compares to like Archfiend of Dross, Abyssal Persecutor, these demons we've seen from the past where you get above the curve stats, but they come with a pretty big drawback. I think the Balrog's drawback is actually really big though. It's 2023, legends are everywhere. Just look at the Lord of the Rings set itself. Like, every creature almost is a legend, which means no matter what format you're playing, from standard to modern to commander, your opponent is likely to have some legends in their deck, which means it's going to be really easy for them to deal with Balrog. Not only does it mean if you attack into a legend, your opponent can just block it with the legend and have it die, and then you lose your Balrog after combat. Your opponent can potentially legend rule themselves. Like, a lot of decks play 4 Ragavans, 4 Skrelvs. So worst case, you play the Balrog, your opponent has a Ragavan, they just cast a second copy, 1 goes to the graveyard because of the legend roll, and then you lose your 5 mana demon as well. So I think when you add that all together, it's just not a very good card that doesn't really line up with modern Magic design. Although I do think it's funny to see legendary punishment, which is something we haven't seen before. Even in Commander, I guess I'm just not hyped about it. Like, we've gotten some really powerful demon commanders recently. Like, Be'lakor is just ridiculous. I think it's the best demon commander, not even close. Comparing that to the Balrog, and the Balrog just looks so bad. I'm honestly not even sure if I would play the Balrog in the 99 of like a Balakor deck. So I think it might just be that the Balrog is kind of just a weird meme card. I'm honestly really curious what the lore is here. There's got to be a reason, that drawback ability where when a legend dies, it goes to the bottom of your library. There's got to be some story implications here for Lord of the Rings, because as far as making a powerful magic card, it just absolutely kind of ruins a Balrog as being a playable card. We also got Frodo in Frodo Determined Hero. So 2 mana 2/2. When it enters a battlefield or attacks, you can attach an equipment you control with mana value 2 or 3 to Frodo. And then as long as it's your turn, prevent all damage that would be dealt to Frodo. So Frodo, hilariously, apparently WotC was a little worried about Colossus Hammer shenanigans. So they seem to intentionally exclude Colossus Hammer from being something you could equip for free, which is actually a little weird to me because we just got a standard card in Kemba that's a 2-drop that can equip Hammer for free, so I'm not sure why it's necessary to have that restriction. But anyway, I guess maybe the Hammer is just too heavy for Frodo, I don't know, but you can't equip the Hammer to Frodo, which does really reduce the possibilities of this card in formats like Historic and Modern. On the other hand, you could play this in an equipment deck, like in, let's say, Historic, a lot of cool equipment, the new swords, Lion Sash, Lizard's Blades, other reconfigure equipment, Bilbo's Ring if you want to go in the halfling world. A lot of the best equipment is in that mana range, 2 or 3 mana, so many of the best equipment is going to work with Frodo. And then this kind of gives you like a backup Kemba, probably worse Kemba, but a backup Kemba. You can play it with Nahiri. There's a lot of support for some sort of equipment deck, so that'll be interesting to try. In Commander, Frodo works with many of the best equipment, the most heavily played equipment: Swiftfoot Boots, Lightning Greaves, Blackblade Reforged, Reaver Creever, all the swords, Loxodon Warhammer, Swarm of the Animus. Those are all things you can free equip, and it gets even better with equipment that have attack triggers, like Sword of the Animist. Once you to attack each turn, because when you attack with the equipped creature, you get to ramp out a land. Well, if you have a Frodo that's equipped with it, you can attack every turn, even if your opponent has good blocks, because of the damage prevention mode. So you're just free to attack and ramp every single turn. But there's one card in specific that I think is probably going to be at its best with Frodo, and that is Sunforger. So sadly, Sunforger a Boros card, so if you're playing Frodo as your commander, this doesn't work, so it'll have to be in the 99. But Frodo seems really, really good with Sunforger. Sunforger, you can pay 2 mana and unattach it from the equipped creature to tutor up a red instant card with mana value 4 or less and play it for free. So this kind of turns Frodo into a ritual. You play Sunforger, and then you play Frodo, you free equip it, you can pay 2 mana to unequip it, and just get whatever instant that you want that's mana value 4 or less. And then when you attack with Frodo, you get to equip it again for free to get around its equip cost, pay 2 more mana, tutor something else out. So I think there's a pseudo combo here almost, with the free equipping and Sunforger can do some really crazy things. So if you're playing Frodo in the 99 of some sort of Boros equipment deck, Sunforger definitely should be in there because the synergy is really, really sweet. So Frodo, not working with Colossus Hammer, probably crosses it off the list for 60 card formats. And in Commander, I think it really pales in comparison to like SRAMs and some of the strongest equipment commanders, but it definitely is something that would be fun to play in the 99 with Sword of the Animus and Sunforgers and such. We also got one Commander precon card, which we just gotta talk about because it's so hilarious. So Tomer's covering the Commander cards over on the MTGGoldfish Commander YouTube, so make sure to head over there, check out his video talking about all the Commander precon cards. But I couldn't resist talking about Bilbo Birthday Celebrant. So Bilbo, 3 mana, 2/3 legendary halfling rogue. It's an Abzan card. It says if you gain life, gain that much +1 instead, and then the real payoff: pay 5 mana, including Abzan mana, tap it, exile it, search your library for any number of creature cards, put them on the battlefield and shuffle, activate this only if you have 111 or more life. So if you can get above 111 life for just 5 mana, you can invite literally every creature in your deck to Bilbo's birthday party, which is absolutely spectacular and hilarious. So I actually really like this card for Commander. I was looking through the most popular Lifegain commanders, and I realized we don't really have an Abzan Lifegain commander. There's plenty of Lifegain commanders, Willow Dust and Karlovs and Alaro and Lethril and Shauna, but there's none in the Abzan color, so this is kind of adding something new. If you want to play all three of these colors and be Lifegain, Bilbo's going to be the way to go. Its first ability, actually pretty strong coming out of the command zone. It's an Angel of Vitality, gaining a little bit of extra life, which in a deck that's built around Lifegain is going to help you get to 111 really quickly. The downside of Bilbo is I'm a little worried if you do build around this, you might accidentally win the game in other ways before you get to 111 life, like Felidar Sovereign, Test of Endurance, Aetherflux Reservoir. These are life gain payoffs that win at 40 life or 50 life rather than 111, so I guess you'll have to think this through, like maybe you don't even play Felidar Sovereign in your Bilbo deck, because if you do, Felidar Sovereign might accidentally win you the game when you're at 60 life rather than 111, and you never get to see Bilbo go off. The ability though, the last one of putting all your creatures into play, we've seen many versions of it. The World Tree for gods, Realmbreaker for praetors, but we've never seen one that's literally put every creature in your deck on the battlefield. And this is just going to be one of the most spectacular turns you've ever had when you pull it off. So if you want to make this deck, there's plenty of good white life gain cards. Rock's Faithmender, essentially a life Panharmonicon doubling your life. Soul Wardens, Beacon of Immortalities. You get payoffs like Sarah's Ascendant and Voice of the Blessed. So you can definitely go turbo life gain. Being in black also gives you some backup win cons. Veto and Sanguine Bond make your opponents lose life as you gain life, so you can use that to try to win the game. Well of Lost Dreams draws you a ton of cards. So the cards exist to build around this. The question's gonna be, how often do you actually get to 111 life? And my guess is, if you build Bilbo Commander, 9 out of 10 games, actually, no, maybe even more than that, maybe 19 out of 20 games, or 99 out of 100 games, the game is not going to end with Bilbo's ability. I think a lot of the time, you're going to win with Veto and Sanguine Bond and Sarah's Ascendance and Voice of the Blessed, or, maybe some of these other cards, Felidar Sovereign, Test of Endurance. So I think actually getting to 111 and winning is going to be relatively rare. However, the 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 111 times that you actually pull off the Bilbo win, it is going to be one of your greatest accomplishments in the history of Magic, and it is going to be absolutely lovely and beautiful and spectacular. And I just love cards like this. I love the challenge cards. Do this really hard, weird thing and get a big reward, and Bilbo is one of the coolest commanders to ever have done that. Finally today, in the realm of lore rarity cards, got a couple of potentially good pauper cards, like Shire Terrace, a land that adds a colorless, or you can pay 1, tap, sack it, search your library for a basic land, put it on the battlefield, tap, and shuffle. Reminds me a lot of Ash Barrens. Ash Barrens makes a colorless mana, or you can basic land cycle it for 1 mana. Very, very similar, except in some ways Shire Terrace is better because you can play it and use the colorless mana, and then later when you need colored mana, you can turn it into another basic land. And Ash Barrens is one of the most played lands in Pauper, so I expect that we'll see Shire Terrace competing with Ash Barrens for this role as a fixer in like 5 color Pauper decks. We also got Peregrin Took, which I'm really hyped about for Modern. So a 3-mana 2/3 legendary halfling citizen says if 1 or more tokens would be created under your control, those tokens plus an additional food are created instead. Then you can sack 3 food to draw a card. So this is another piece of the Token Factory deck. We talked about this deck yesterday, where you play Lannis and now Samwise, and then you play Academy Manufacturer. So when you play a creature, it's going to trigger your Lannis to make a clue, but that's also going to be a food and a treasure thanks to Academy Manufacturer. You trigger Samwise to make a food, but it's also a clue in a treasure thanks to Academy Manufacturer. Peregrin Took, perfect for this deck. It's another way to make an extra token to trigger your manufacture, and the ability to cash your food in for cards is actually very, very strong to keep the combo going. Plus, it's cheap enough to be hit by collected companies, so I don't know exactly how many Peregrin Tooks I will play in the deck, but the Token Factory archetype seems to be getting way, way better thanks to this set. Back to Pauper for a minute. Cast Into the Fire seems like another card that could have some Pauper potential. So 2 mana instant, 1 damage to each of up to 2 target creatures, or exile target artifact. And I think this is probably a really nice sideboard card. If you look at the Pauper meta, Revoke Existence is kind of a staple sideboard card in the format. Exile an artifact or enchantment for 2 mana. Cast Into the Fire, you don't get to get enchantments, but you still get to get rid of artifacts, which is more important, I think, than enchantments in Pauper. You got the Affinity deck being very popular. Plus, 1 damage to each of up to 2 target creatures makes this a way to snipe Delvers and snipe Fairies. There's a lot of X1s running around Elves, so I think Cast into the Fire seems like another card that could have a pretty big impact out of sideboards in Pauper. Otherwise, there's a ton more lore rarity stuff, just a ton of jank, a ton of draft stuff, some more legendary uncommons, which you can find them all over at MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Lord of the Rings spoilers for today. So what do you think? What's your favorite card of the day? What are you most hyped for? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll be back tomorrow with more daily Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth spoilers. Until then, have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you soon. If you want even more magic, check out this week's Budget Magic, where we play a $100 build of Boros Convoke Pioneer and try to find out if Hogak is really legal in the format, or maybe the video where we talk about the worst Magic the Gathering cards to have ever been banned.